Okay, so today we're going to talk about African Americans and the New South. Um, there's a good book that describes a little bit of the African American experience um, called Worse Than Slavery, Parchment Farm and Convict Leasing. It's written by David Oshinsky. He won the Robert F. Kennedy Award for this, but he also won the Pulitzer Prize book for another book he did on polio. Pulitzer Prize in polio. I really had to get him to do something for the Rotary. If I could reach out to him. So we're going to talk about African Americans in the New South. And there's going to be a group of white Southerners who want to be known as the Redeemers. They're going to redeem the South. They want a new modern South, an industrial South with economic diversity, not necessarily just cotton production. But they were usually former Confederates who also wanted to strip African Americans of their rights. They would want to redeem the South back to white supremacy. And part of the Redeemers' idea was to begin promulgating that idea of the lost cause, that really the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, and everybody was fighting for an honorable cause. In other words, rewriting the history. And we've said this several times in this class, that we'll say that winners write the history, but that's not the case in the American Civil War. The losers wrote the history until just very recently in terms of the historical record. And then it's finally began to be straightened out. Well, anyway, there was a newspaper editor by the name of Henry Grady. He was one of the best known redeemers out there. He outlined his vision in an editorial 1867. And his plan really was to diversify the South away from agriculture, that not relying so much on a monocrop like cotton, but still also bringing back white supremacy. And so his plan is going to have some success. The Duke family created industrial cigarette manufacturing and established the American Tobacco Company. Birmingham became a steel town. Kentucky and West Virginia developed coal fields. The Carolinas became a home to textile mills that would surpass the New England states in manufacturing of textiles. And if you're wondering about that, how that happened, because we've talked about in this class several times, is that that manufacturing, at least textile manufacturing, was something that was mainly in the New England states. And so how did it switch to the Carolinas? Well, in the New England states, they began passing laws against child labor. And so when those states began passing laws that banned child labor, textile industries moved to southern states where there were no laws regulating child labor. Well, the South also developed a huge forest industry. This is where Gifford Pinchot will start. We'll talk about Gifford Pinchot later. He becomes really good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and will get crossways with Taft that will lead to a split in the Republican Party in the 1912 election. In the 1870s and 80s, Southern states also write new constitutions, which will take away the rights of African Americans they had gained under Reconstruction. Now, the 15th Amendment had been passed that gave African American males the right to vote, right? It says the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, creed, color, or a previous condition of servitude. You still could deny it based on gender, obviously. Southerners resented this. Many Southerners argued that freedmen weren't educated enough or didn't have the knowledge to be effective voters, which was true. But that didn't make them any different than millions of Southern white voters. So they come up with all these different ways to prevent African Americans voting. Of course, this is the Democratic Party because they're the #1 party in the South at the time. In 1898, Louisiana created the Grandfather Clause, which said that if your grandfather had not been eligible to vote in the 1860 election before slavery was abolished, you could not vote. And so what happened was that in 1896, before the law was passed, you had 130,000 registered African Americans voting in Louisiana. By 1900, 5,300. Now, we'll see that get struck down a little bit later. We'll come back to it. They also created the poll tax, which said that you had to pay a tax before you could register to vote. Usually you had to pay this tax in January, and then the election wouldn't be until November. And if you lost the receipt, then you didn't get to vote. Or if you forgot to pay it in January, you didn't get to vote. And if you think about it, the poll tax was equivalent to a week's worth of groceries. So imagine if you were poor and you could either feed your family for a week or register to vote. Now, we'll later see the poll tax outlawed in federal elections with the passage of the 24th Amendment in the 1950s, and then in state elections and subsequent court cases in the 1960s. The other thing that they came up with is a literacy test. The literacy test said you had to take a test to show that you could understand the issues that were going around in politics than when you went to vote. Now, the literacy tests often didn't have anything to do with that. They would ask you to interpret Beowulf. Alabama had a famous question: how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Now, the problem with the literacy test is that you would also catch white people in it. They go, well, we can't have that. So what they did was that most states created what they call an understanding clause. They said that if the registrar of voters felt that you had an understanding of the issues, then you could go ahead and vote. Well, how did they know who had an understanding of the issues? Well, if you were white, you had an understanding of the issues. Now, the literacy test, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. It'll eventually be suspended, not abolished, by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So not that long ago. So disenfranchisement was an uneven process, faster in some areas than others. Most usually followed what Mississippi had done. And then there was Jim Crow. This was legal racial segregation. The South really could not understand a world without slavery. So if they couldn't have slavery, they would keep the trappings of slavery, and they would legally separate the races. Or in many cases, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, if you take a look at this book by David Oshinsky, it talks how they arrest a lot of African Americans on really no charges and essentially sell them to people as slaves. This will go on for a long time. And this begins the convict leasing system in the United States. That's Worse Than Slavery, Parchment Farm and the Ordeal of Jim Crow Justice by David Oshinsky. Good book, not too long. You can read it pretty quickly. Well, so they want to separate the races. And I should point out that let's not just say Democrats and Republicans here. Let's say both liberals and progressives and conservatives felt that separation of the races was a good thing. And so Louisiana passes a law that said that you had to have separate railroad cars for blacks and whites. Now, the railroad companies didn't like this because this had to double the number of cars on the train, right? You had to have the same amount. They were opposed to it, but the law passes anyway. Well, there was a group of businessmen in New Orleans who said, we're going to challenge the law. And what they're going to do is they're going to get a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who is 1/8 African-American, and they're going to buy a ticket and they're going to get him on the white car. Now, they're going to allow the authorities to know who Homer Plessy is, that he's 1/8 African-American. And what they're going to see is that if they arrest Homer Plessy, okay, then they'll challenge the court. If they don't, that they're saying that 1/8 is okay, then they're going to try to find somebody who's 1/4 and then 1/2. In other words, try to find a way to make the state define who's black and who's white. Well, Plessy's arrested for riding in the white-only car. He gets on, he's immediately arrested. And this is appealed to the United States Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court, and this is again where I tell people when they don't like what the Supreme Court does on a particular ruling, the Supreme Court issues opinions, right? They're not saying this is a fact, this is an opinion. And the Supreme Court can make some pretty bad rulings, and this is going to be one of those bad rulings. The Supreme Court's going to uphold the Louisiana law and begins what we call the doctrine of separate but equal. That as long as the facility were equal, they were constitutional. Now, they're never going to be equal, and this is going to lead to separate schools, separate churches, separate waiting areas for train stations, you name it, separate everything, and they're never equal. Now, it's interesting to note that the vote here was 8-1, and the person that dissented was Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former slave owner. And in fact, he says, and I'm quoting here, that in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. So I know you say, well, that's really good, but he goes along later on the dissent and criticizes Chinese people. But John Marshall Harlan was known as the great dissenter, as dissenting in many cases. Now, of course, racial segregation was degrading. Sometimes it worked well for African, sometimes, very rarely, the rare occasion it worked for African Americans, because on the train there was a drunk white guy and they tried to put him in the car with the African American passengers, and they sued and they said, no, you can't put white people in the black car. White Southerners favored segregation because they saw it as God's will and believed it was what they call the state of nature. Blacks will self-segregate themselves in churches, which was interesting. But as I said, the segregation is rarely going to be equal. Redeemer governments refused to spend much money on public education for African Americans. In 1900, for example, 50% of blacks were illiterate, 12% of whites. Southern state governments also ignored lynchings, which were a common occurrence. There were even lynchings up into the 1980s. African Americans were the main targets, but sometimes Jews as well. African Americans also in many places could not own property. And so they were sharecroppers. A sharecropper is a person who rented land to grow crops and then gave a share of the crop to the landowners, a payment. Now, not payment only for the land, but the sharecropper rarely had any money to start the year. So they'd have to borrow money for a mule, a seed, a plow, food. And these were always rented to them at inflated prices. So the sharecropper found out that his crop hardly ever covered his debt, that he was always in debt. Part of this was declining crop prices, especially in cotton, as Britain had started growing crops in India and other places during the Civil War. And growing cotton was labor intensive and hard work. And since sharecroppers didn't own the land, their incentive to improve the land was very low. And nobody trusted anybody in the sharecropper system, and mainly because you would get to settlement day. And just sort of define what settlement day was. Settlement day was the day you settled up on your debt. You'd bring in your crops, you'd have to give a percentage of your crops to the landowner. And of course, if you're the sharecropper, you never, ever, ever got to see the books, right? The landowner did, and he said, okay, you owe me, and he'd look at your crop and go, okay, well, you owe me all that crop. You have none to sell. And then if you said, well, look, I've got some more outside, and he would say, oh, look, there's another page. You owe me additional money. I'll take that too. So it was a constant system of never being able to leave your land and living in extreme poverty. Now, as I said, there were some that looked at segregation as positive and some that are negative. And even within the African American community, for example, Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915 was his life span. He favored accommodation with segregation. His mother was a slave, his father was white. He had received an education at Hampton Institute, which was created by a former Union general. He lives in Alabama. He worked his way through college. You have to forgive me, I'm having a cough here for a second. And then in 1881, he found the Tuskegee Institute, built by the students. Hang on, I was going to cough again. He said that you should prepare for mechanical jobs, because he said that as a community, we shouldn't fool ourselves that we could be doctors, lawyers, or even have political power. That wasn't going to happen. He would raise money for the school from white donors. He told whites that they could trust African Americans because it had always been that they were more on their side than the recent immigrants. So even Booker T. Washington running a little bit of a nativist sentiment there. Now, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. Well, as you can imagine, this caused a huge uproar. You say, well, because there was a black man at the White House? No, Frederick Douglass had been in the White House lots of times. The difference is Teddy Roosevelt invited him to dinner, to sit at the same dinner table. And the idea of two people sitting at the same dinner table implies the idea of equality. And so Southerners were in an outrage that Teddy Roosevelt would sit down to dinner with a black man. Now, Roosevelt defended himself, but Booker T. Washington was never invited to dinner again. From now on, he would come into the back door, and then he would talk to the president in his office, but not for dinner. Now, on the other side of it is W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868, 1963. I mean, Du Bois was alive when I was alive. He did not like Booker T. Washington. He was the first African-American to get his PhD at Harvard. And so he said that Booker T. Washington is a leader in the black community in white people's eyes only. And he said that African Americans have two identities. They were Negro and they were American. He didn't want to Africanize America, as he said, because he believed America had much to teach the world. Nor did he want to purge what he said, the Negro inside, because it was a necessary voice in society. He believed in a policy of ceaseless agitation against segregation. And he, along with Mary White Overton, Oswald Villard, will found the NAACP. And he would always want to push for equality now. So when we look at W.E.B. Du Bois and we look at Booker T. Washington, and you say, well, Booker T. Washington was not going to push the system. He was willing to go along to get along and say, we won't do certain jobs because whites won't let us, and you can trust black people. And then here's W. Du Bois who said, no, we need rights right now. It's hard to take sides here because, first off, you have to look at geography. Where is Booker T. Washington? He's in Alabama, right? And so he knows there's only a limit of what he can do in Alabama to help people in Alabama without having the Klan and the state come down hard on them. Whereas Du Bois, he's in Massachusetts, right? He's in the North where he can speak out a little bit more clearly than Booker T. Washington could do. But founding the NAACP is going to be a very important role in overcoming segregation. One of its first legal successes was striking down, oddly enough, the grandfather clause in the famous case of Gwynn versus Oklahoma in 1919. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but Du Bois will later be a leading critic of Marcus Garvey. So when we look at African Americans in the New South, to sum up a lot of this, where we are is African Americans had gained some political rights during Reconstruction, but once Reconstruction goes away and white supremacists are back in power in the South, African Americans lose property rights, they lose civil rights, and they lose their political power. And it's that struggle that will be played out through the 20th century. And even today, we see a little of that struggle going on. Not a little, a lot. So it's the ongoing process of what's been going on in America for a long time. This isn't anything new. Okay, so that's a short lecture. Next time, we'll talk about the West and winning the West, and we'll talk about George Custer. We'll talk about exodusters. We'll talk about the cattle industry. That'll be quite moving. Okay, I'm sorry I said that.